Welcome, Quentin. Good to see you there. Okay, so taking a look at international relations. In a fantasy world, this refers to the interactions and alliances, conflicts, diplomacy between various nations, races, and tribes. We can think about this in terms of the impact that it has on the plot, what it does to character development, the cultural understanding and changes that it creates in that cultural understanding, and of course, its historical significance and power dynamics. So, we're going to plunge into into international relations and talk first about the importance of world building and geography. So, in world building, when you're thinking about your international relations, it is really important to think about the geography because it makes a huge difference to your relationships between nations. If you think about in our world, the Himalayas, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it, Himalayas have historically isolated India, for example, from the rest of Asia, providing a providing a natural barrier against invasions. And of course, it influenced trade routes because the Silk Road ran across the kind of length of Asia, but there was a separate route that had to be followed to get the spices from India that specifically went over the Himalayas. Even rivers can be a substantial influence on your international relations. If you think of the Nile is why Egypt was such a powerhouse in the ancient world because they could transport trade, they could transport the tin for bronze, they could transport no treaty of West. Sure. All of these treaties are important, but so the thing with the geography is it is going to impact your international relations. If people can talk to each other easily, there will be relationships between those countries. If they can travel from one country to another, there'll be relationships. And you could look at like fantasy examples of this as well. Um, Tolkien used the Misty Mountains as a natural boundary between the lands of the East and the West. In Jacqueline Carey's books, she changed things like the Viking raids because the master of the straits made the channel between France and England basically unnavigable. And this, of course, meant that the Vikings had a much more limited opportunity to raid, and that fundamentally changed both Scandinavia and Europe. So, when you're setting up your international relationships, you definitely want to think about the effect of uh, geography and the kind of constitution of your world. Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Treaty of Westphalia, since that came up. So, in the Peace of Westphalia, this was the European settlement of 1648, which brought an end to the 80 Years' War between Spain and Dutch and the German phase of the 30 Years' War. The peace was negotiated from 1644 in the Westphalian town of Münster and Osnabrück. So, why the Treaty of Westphalia was important is because it's one of those, if I remember correctly, and I'm speaking under correction here, it was one of those that kind of established the creation of nation states to a large extent. It kind of set that boundary marker. And I think it was one of the first ones that was really signed between nation states as such. So, in terms of our history, it's worth like looking up for curiosity. And it's been a while since I looked at it, so I'd have to like check it live. Which I suppose, is kind of the point of live stream. So let me quickly open up the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is my favorite tool to use to look this stuff up because it's reasonably well researched. Fortunately, it doesn't have a straight importance. So the Treaty of October 24, 1648, comprehended the Holy Roman Empire Ferdinand and the German princes France and Sweden, where only European powers that were not represented at the two assemblies. Some scholars of international relations credit the treaties with providing the foundation for the modern state system, including articulating the concept of territorial sovereignty. So that is why the Treaty of Westphalia is so important. It literally kind of set the stage for the nation state, the concept of land sovereignty. I mean, even the Ukraine war right now is predicated on the concept that Ukraine has a sovereign right to the country that is defined as Ukraine. So all of that echoes back into Westphalia. Is there something like I'm not sure what an apostolic palace is. I was talking about the Treaty of Westphalia and how it created the concept of a nation state. And I mean, that is what international relations between countries does. It does have an impact on cultures. It does have an impact on societies and on religion, indeed. You can see that when you look at the way that religions have kind of influenced each other as they spread from nation state to nation state. And then again, if you look at Europe during the Middle Ages, shading into the Renaissance, the unifying force was the concept of Christianity. And it was the one thing that could bring the powers of Europe together to face an external threat under the under the blessing of the Pope in terms of the Crusades and so on. So religion can definitely have a very fundamental effect on your international relationships, because what religion provides you is a force that can extend over the boundaries of a nation state. So if you look in, for example, in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, he uses the state religion of the final empire as a tool of control, and its relationship with other belief systems influences the plot and the character development in that system. If you look at George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the old religion of the first men, where they worship the trees, is gradually replaced by the worship in the seven gods. So you have the religion that unifies various parts of the kingdom, and then these guys move north and north, and the old religion is driven further and further up north until it's only the Starks who practice the old religion alongside the new religion of the seven. International relations obviously also have quite a fundamental effect on politics and power structures. If you look at our social political structures, you can very much see domino effects happening as they spread between countries. So if you look at the Napoleonic period specifically, France made the switch from monarchy to republic, right? Yes, I know they went through phases of republicanism, and Napoleon was definitely not like elected as such. but um, but it does make that switch. And then all of the other powers of Europe literally formed what they called grand coalitions to oppose France. And they did that in order to fight France, to ensure that this democracy didn't spread to the monarchies that still dominated the rest of Europe. They were very frightened of this new this democracy coming through the Enlightenment and spreading to their countries and putting all of their heads on a spike, especially after, of course, the 10 years of the terror and Robespierre's activities and so on. So they actively opposed the one odd man out in the social democratic in the social political systems, and they kind of tried to contain it. Now, of course, Napoleon really did do a great. I mean, it took six grand coalitions is what it took to actually contain Napoleon, which is honestly, it is impressive. Um, and in the end, obviously, he was overthrown, but it was also too late, because you could see the seeds of revolution spreading from France to each nation, and basically like a contagion infecting the monarchs around France and leading to like revolutions everywhere in Europe as monarchy came to an end, or at least was stripped of most of their powers, turning into um, democracies and with a constitutional monarchy. Of course, international. Yep, exactly. Kit makes a very valid point there. Being a republic, France had the buy-in of the people, right? Because the thing about a monarchy, and okay, so here's a little personal anecdote. I was talking to somebody in Bahrain in 2018. Like I was there for work, and I was talking to somebody there, and a person who lives there in Bahrain. And at the time, the king was considering bringing in taxation, personal income taxation, and the people's protest basically took the form of no. If you want to tax us, we want a say in who governs. So you can only implement income tax if you are also going to become a constitutional monarch. You cannot remain in charge as you are currently and implement income tax. And I think that that kind of applies throughout kind of history. You will ultimately, as a republic, you have more buy-in from your citizens. You can see it in the Roman Republic as well. Rome could conscript huge parts of their citizenry because it was seen as part of your duty. This is your job as a member of the republic. And as such, Napoleon could outman most of the rest of Europe for that reason. Quinton made a good comment there about the Hittite and Egyptian treaty after the Battle of Kadesh. Yes, some of the ancient world treaties that have remained to us, and of course there haven't been many because, even clay tablets break, but some of the ancient treaties that have come to us through the ages very definitely echo a lot of what we see here. Like people would fight, and then, there'd be a treaty between them, and then they'd end up being friends against another foe. Like this is just, it's the way that international relations work. You think that people are going to be enemies forever, but that largely isn't true. And yes, they exchanged princesses, and the borders were agreed on, and it was kept. Political change affects similar cultures more strongly than distant cultures. Yes, absolutely. So the democracy spread in Europe during that period of the revolution, but it didn't necessarily spread far beyond Europe, because when you've got a lot in common with your neighbors and you then also have your things happening with them, then that spreads more easily to neighboring countries and cities. So yes, absolutely, political change would have a certain amount of echoing power, and then it would stop, or at least it would peter out and become weaker and weaker. Of course, part of international relations is definitely trade and economy, and it is important to think about the relationships that build up in a trade and economy. Um, Trade does a couple of things. Of course, it helps the countries in terms of trading resources, but it also trades ideas. Ideas flow from one country to another on the trade caravans. People talk to each other. And this conversation that they have is so fundamental to the growth of new ideas and technology changing. So ideas do not do well in a vacuum. They really do need other ideas to bounce off against, because no matter how intelligent one person is, there's only so far that they can go without somebody else to interact with to bounce ideas off. So the more trade you have, the more your technology and science advances. And I mean, the most clear illustration for this, for me, remains the Silk Road, where the goods flowed through the Arab world in both ways, both from Europe and from China. And while the Silk Road was open, the Muslim world experienced the golden age of the Muslim world. And after the Portuguese found the southern sea route around the bottom point of Africa, that golden age came to an end. And I think it is quite simply the ideas were no longer being carried back and forth. Quinton says, so much diplomacy seems to be revolutionized after a peace treaty. Yeah. So war is one of the ultimate acts of international relationships. I mean, war is a fundamental political act, and it's the extreme one. It's the very, very violent one. And wars have got dramatic impact on societies. Everything changes after a war. And then, of course, when you sign a peace treaty, you define the new relationship going forward. Everything has now been reset, hopefully, at least in part, and you have a new framework for building your pathway forward. Yes, Kit brings up that related to trade is piracy. The US Navy and Marines went international because of the Barbary pirates. Yeah, piracy, especially during the age of sail, was a huge problem. And they would rob trade ships, especially. And of course, many of these countries depended on trade for a lot of things, for trade goods, as well as for interacting with, for trade goods, as well as for like the money it brings in and all the rest of that. And the pirates, obviously, it was a matter of national security for many countries. And hence, the UK implemented the system of privateers. The USA went international with the Navy and Marines in order to combat piracy. So Romans and China definitely traded, but the two empires were so far apart that I doubt they ever sent a delegation to each other or something like that. But there has been Roman glass found in China. And there has been silk found in Rome. So there was definitely trade between the two empires. What would be the spark of political change? Like, is war the only way a government changes? No, not necessarily. So you can have governments and international relationships change for many reasons. If I think just of Finland, for example, we were a colony of Sweden for 700 years. And then Sweden lost a war to Russia, and they gave us a way to Russia um, for the next 300 years. And we were then a grand duchy of the Empire of Russia. And the odd thing about that is we got a constitution with Tsar Nicholas. With the Russian Tsars, they were constitutional Grand Dukes of Finland. But Russia proper didn't get a constitution with the Tsars, which is just, it's so weird. But anyway, so there are other things besides war that can spark changes in government and international relations. Economics can make a huge change. Like if you think of oil, okay, if a country discovers oil, they suddenly have all the friends in the world who are ready to trade with them. In our world, in your world, you could have such an item as well. You discover some kind of magical element, and suddenly everybody wants to be that country's friend. There can also be improvements in technology and travel, improvements in all kinds of things that can change your relationships, your international relationships, and your governmental systems. I mean, England's first constitution, the Magna Carta, came about with John Lackland being forced by his barons to sign, the Magna Carta. And I wouldn't call that a revolution exactly. They just brought an enormous amount of pressure to bear on it. You can change a government by other means. And I would argue that in general, by the time you reach revolution or war or one of those activities, you have probably tried almost everything else. I mean, the First World War, yes, they were spoiling to go to have a fight, but people don't generally want to go to war. They have to be convinced to go to war. It's not like, we don't come out of the box going like, I want to shoot up those other people, or, like that's not how most of us are out of the box. So you have to be whipped into that kind of frenzy, and that takes a lot of effort. So I think that, war, revolution, rebellion, these are all the end game, not the starting point of evoking change. In terms of trade, I also do want to talk about the Hanseatic League and like the impact that they had on international relationships. So the Hanseatic League was a configuration of merchant guilds and market towns in the northwestern and central Europe. And they were like the Amazon of their day. Okay, so they would set up like these huge warehouses and between the trading ports, and they would go to a city and be like, if you want us to put one of our warehouses in your city, then we won't pay any taxes. And you'll just be happy with that because we're bringing in all of this work and trade and so on. And I mean, most cities folded. But for example, the King of Denmark didn't want the Hanseatic League in his country to start with. Denmark or Sweden, I might be getting it mixed up. And they actually hired a mercenary army and went to war with a sovereign nation, at least a kingdom, and forced the ports to open to Hanseatic ships, which, you know, like people talk about the kind of terrible, we do this is what happens when people have kind of a lot of capital available to them. This is just, it just is where it ends up. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm a fan of the capitalist system. I do not want to live under socialism, but I do also believe in a regulated market, because things like the Hanseatic League. Okay, so um, yeah, exactly. Kit. It sounds like Commodore Perry, but it was way before him. The Hanseatic League was, it was like, let me check when they had their war. Because again, it's worth checking. Hanseatic League War. Yeah, they were at their height in 1469 to 1474, around there. So they were ages before Commander Perry. Somebody had this had this idea of like going to war to force the ports open. Um, so in terms of conflict and diplomacy, we've been talking about a lot of it, but if you look at your various types of conflict and diplomacy, of course, the world wars spring to mind, but there have been a lot of wars, especially in Europe. Europe is I know Europe on a map looks bigger, but that's just because of the curvature of the earth. Europe is actually quite small, and there's a lot of people crushed together on Europe, and there's like limited amounts of land, and that I think is why Europe is the PvP server of the world. The environment is basically tamed, and everybody is just battling over, um, over it. Yes, smoke dementia. It definitely, mercenaries could make it so that the merchants did strong arm the royalty until, of course, mercenary companies became outlawed, and or at least curtailed, and nation states developed as a concept to the point where they had real standing armies. Bear in mind that kings of the Middle Ages did not have standing armies. I mean, people think they do, but they didn't. The whole concept of feudal lordship is basically a Ponzi scheme almost, or a pyramid scheme, where you owe loyalty upwards. um, has anyone from, say, Turkey ever intermarried with someone from further east? I believe so. Um, I don't know if they ever married, say, like a Chinese princess. It's it's possible that they married a Chinese princess. Um, we can, but I don't see any reason why not, to be completely honest with you. I think that in a fantasy version, in your fantasy world, all you would have to do to get such a relationship going is make sure that you have a strong Silk Road, right? The equivalent of a Silk Road, obviously, in your world. You want to make sure that whoever's getting married at least knows about and has a good reason to make an alliance with the country on the other side of that trade route. Like maybe there's a potential for there to be an establishment of a new magical form of travel. Or maybe there's a sea route that's a possibility, and they're now sealing this agreement. Or maybe the two powers could be wanting to unite against the central power that controls the trade route between them. And that is why this marriage is taking place. Think of marriages at that level in terms of the diplomatic benefit it would bring to those countries. Um, I think that it's also important to think about the different kinds of conflict that you can have. Like, don't forget about things like the Cold War, and kind of, the more tense conflicts that aren't as hot and immediate as an actual war. Yes, Kit makes a very valid point on the unreliable mercenaries of the Italian peninsula. In fact, it's one of the things that fundamentally affected a lot of Italy's city states. So Italy had to keep hiring these mercenaries, these condottieri. I think I spoke about them in one of my videos. I remember doing a bit of research on them. And basically, these guys would switch sides or they would demand higher pay. And the cities didn't have any standing armies. My cat's dying in the background. Not really, but you know. The the cities had to hire these mercenary troops and just hope for the best. You know, hope that they would stick to their contract. Yeah, the space race is a great example of what is essentially a contest between two nations that doesn't involve any conflict and is all just about them flexing their wealth and their power. And then, of course, I mean, you know, technology and magic makes quite a lot of difference in international relations in your world. But I mean, if you think about like in our world, we have things like the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty that says you're not allowed to sell nuclear secrets to a non-nuclear nation. You know, only countries have to either develop nuclear knowledge by themselves or be let into the club in some way or whatever the case may be. And the countries that have nuclear weapons kind of sealed that treaty and enforced it. Um, and that's why, for example, Israel and South Africa, who were both essentially excluded from the international community, worked together to develop nukes for that reason. So you could have the same kind of thing in your world where there's a country that has a specific technology or a specific magic, and they kind of hold on to it and they don't, you know, proliferate it. They will sell you the product of that magic, the items that generate from it, but never the process that creates those items. Um, and of course, I mean, if you think about like George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the dragons were basically nukes that the Targaryen kings had. And then when they didn't have them, that's when issues started coming around. Because it's one thing to be a mad king if you have a dragon. Like, it's fine. You know, you can suffer under a mad king if the option is keep him happy or get flamed by his dragon. But once they no longer had dragons, they were just one mad king away from getting deposed. And that obviously is also what happened, how the series played out. And, you know, it is also important to think about how your historical context of your nations are shaped by the past's examples. So if you think just in terms of Finland, I was talking to Drake today about Finland. Still, when we play against Sweden, when we play ice hockey against Sweden, which is often, we um, it is a grudge match. Despite the fact that our nations today, I mean, we're part of the Nordic Council, we trust each other, we work together. If it came to a war, we'd be on each other's sides, we have each other's back. But when it comes to hockey, we remember that they owned us for 700 years and we're like, I'm going to stab you in the face, you know, with a hockey puck. And it is worth remembering that there is a memory that stays with people, even when there's been a treaty, even when nation states have become friends, where they remember the past and that kind of shapes their current worldview. Brandon Sanderson does a pretty good job of doing that in the Stormlight archive. Although I don't know, is anybody up to date with the Stormlight archive? I have decided that I need to wait until that whole series comes out. I lose too much if I try and read it all at one go. So I've read like the first two, then I tried to read the third one, and I was just like, I have no memory of anything that happened before this. So I don't know how everybody else feels about that. um, yeah. So that was International Relations live stream. Are there any other questions, thoughts? I hope you all enjoyed this. Thumbs up button, super thanks if you feel up to it, if you can. And let me know in the comments, in the chat, what you thought of this kind of format. And if you want to get in, if you want to see this again, and how you would change the format if you could, and so on. Okay. You guys have a great night, day, depending on where you are in the world. And I will chat to you again soon. Oh, hold on. I have one question here. Quentin asks, when did formal embassies with diplomatic immunity and so on begin? So I think to some extent diplomatic immunity has kind of existed, sort of, although there was a lot of shooting the messenger. Um, but so it looks like it was. I mean, the Greeks had embassies with each other, so arguably, then. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.